Isaiah chapter number 9. It could very well be one of the most often quoted, famous passages in at least the Old Testament. If you've ever been to hear Handel's Messiah, you've heard these words repeatedly in that great work. Isaiah chapter number 9. We're beginning a series of messages that will take us all the way to our Christmas Eve service out of this chapter. In fact, most of those messages, or all of those messages, will focus on just one verse. So this morning we begin that study in this series out of this great chapter of the Bible. Isaiah chapter number 9. Would you notice with me verse number 1? But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, and land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shone. You have multiplied the nations. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest. They are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of the oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and he shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. An amazing passage of Scripture. Again, we're going to focus really on the 6th verse, but to get the full magnitude of what is transpiring in Isaiah 9, we need to establish a little bit of a historical context of what was going on when these words were first given to mankind through the prophet Isaiah. To fully appreciate the magnitude of these words, we need to examine what was going on. Now, back in chapter number 8, Isaiah pronounces some rather dire predictions of difficulties and sufferings that are going to be coming upon God's people. Look at chapter 8, verse 22. And they will look to the earth, but behold, distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. Now, the word darkness there is a Hebrew word that's not talking about the darkness of night. It's talking about a supernatural darkness. It's talking about a relational darkness or an emotional darkness. It's talking about a calamity, something that is overwhelming. And you say, it's a dark day in my soul. And that's what he's talking about in that verse. Now, here's what happened. During the reign of a man by the name of Ahaz, King Ahaz, 739 BC, Judah was faced with a difficult international situation. Turmoil, great turmoil. Sound familiar? God's people are still dealing with turmoil. To the north, an alliance was forming between Syria and the 10 northern tribes of Israel. So the Jewish people that were once a united kingdom have separated. 10 kingdoms to the north, Judah, basically, along with Ephraim, to the south. And so the 10 tribes of the north form an alliance with Syria. Not only do they form an alliance, but that alliance is already pressing southward, taking over city after city after city on a march toward Jerusalem. And Ahaz knows, that's kind of challenging to say, Ahaz knows that his kingdom is in great peril. He's faced with the potential loss of his kingdom. So he has some choices to make. One, he can surrender to the 10 northern tribes and to Syria and basically say, okay, I will pay you tribute if you'll allow me basically to survive. It's kind of like the early version of the mafia. I'll pay you as long as you don't attack me. The second option is Ahaz could turn to the south and form an alliance with the true superpower of the world at that time, which was Assyria. You have Syria in the north, Assyria to kind of the south. This would offer him protection from the alliance of the north. So that's what he's considering. What do I do? Do I form an alliance or join the alliance of the north, or do I form an alliance with Assyria? So God, realizing what's going on, raises up Isaiah. In fact, he speaks to Isaiah and he says, I want you and your son to go to this particular location and I want you to speak to Ahaz. And the Lord basically, through Isaiah, tells Ahaz that he doesn't need to form an alliance with anyone. All he needs to do is put his trust in the Lord. God told him, I've been faithful to Israel and to Judah in the past. I will be faithful again. In fact, if you'll look at chapter 8, verse 9, chapter 8, where are we at here? Here we go. It will not stand. In chapter 7, he says, it will not stand, and it shall not come to pass. The head of Syria is Damascus. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. So the Lord's saying, don't form an alliance. Ahaz ignores that. He ignores the word of the Lord. He ignores Isaiah, and he forms an alliance with Assyria. And true to form, Assyria does protect him for a time from Syria and the 10 tribes. In fact, Assyria utterly attacks Syria and the 10 tribes and basically annihilates them. In our opening verse, it talks about the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. That's what he's talking about. That's that land. And it was absolutely devastated by Assyria. But it wasn't long before Ahaz himself and his kingdom was also conquered by Assyria. So, choosing instead to live in the short term by what his eyes could see, his nation, his people were plunged into deep darkness and gloom. And that's what you read in chapter. In fact, look at it. Chapter 7, verse 23. In that day, every place where there used to be 1,000 vines worth 1,000 shekels of silver will become briars and thorns. With bow and arrows, a man will come. For all the land will be briars and thorns, and for all the hills that used to be hoed with a hoe, you will not come there for fear of briars and thorns, for they will become a place where cattle are let loose and where sheep tread. As promised, they were taken over, just as the Lord said. So, in short order, Judah suffers great devastation. Now, it's not a happy picture. These were difficult days in the history of the nation of Israel. Difficult days. But the chapter 9 opens with this amazing, shining hope. It's like the sun coming up upon this darkness. There's a message of coming hope that is bright and is clear. Assyria turned into this land into a place of deep darkness and gloom in every possible way. It was economic destruction. It was governmental destruction. They conquered it, literally conquered it in every conceivable way. Yet Isaiah looks forward to a day when the depleted and dark territory that they now find themselves in would be miraculously and supernaturally transformed. There were better days ahead. Those better days came in part through a king that was Ahaz's son named Hezekiah. He instituted all kinds of religious reform, and there was a time of recovery for Judah in particular and the folks of Jerusalem. But again, that was short-lived. And that's really, I don't believe what Isaiah is seeing here, because it doesn't fit the description. While things did get better under Hezekiah, this is talking about something entirely different. Entirely different. You see, Isaiah is seeing a day that is much more significant. Notice the contrast. We're in chapter 9. Look at verse 2. The contrast. Isaiah said, light will replace darkness. Light will replace darkness. The people who walked in darkness, and the word walk there literally means to live. People who have lived in that darkness, that psychological darkness, that emotional darkness, that supernatural darkness. The people who have lived in darkness have seen a great light. And those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shone. So it's light instead of darkness. Light instead of darkness. But notice the second contrast. Joy replaces sorrow. Look at verse 3. You have multiplied the nations. You have increased its joy. You see it? They rejoice before you as with joy after the harvest, and they're glad when they divide the spoil. Now, he's talking here about the joy of the harvest. When everything has been harvested, and you've had a bumper crop, and that's a great day, isn't it? Wow, we've been working, we planted, we did all the things that we needed to do. We harvested, and look at what the Lord has blessed us with. What a great joy. But he's also talking about a great military victory. They're dividing the spoil. This is a conquering. That we have subdued an enemy, conquered them, and look at the spoil that is ours. So what he's saying is this sorrow will give way to incredible joy. All right, so light instead of darkness, joy instead of sorrow. But notice verses 4 and 5, freedom rather than bondage or oppression. Look at verse 4. For as in the day of Midian, you have shattered the yoke of their burden, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of the oppressor. Every trampling boot and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for fire. In other words, he's talking here about the fact that those who have oppressed you, and he's talking about these military endeavors, he said those things will evaporate. We're going to burn all that up by fire. It's going to be gone. There'll no longer be oppression. There'll no longer be bondage. There no longer will be subjection, but you will live in freedom. So light instead of darkness, joy instead of sorrow, freedom instead of oppression. An unbelievable reversal. Unbelievable. It's the dawn of hope. The great reversal. It's an amazing thing he's talking about here. I remember over the years sitting down with people who lived during the Great Depression. And it was just really hard. People were eating, food was scarce. People waited in lines, particularly in the larger metropolitan areas. And when that relief finally came, when that recovery finally came, it was this euphoric feeling. That's what's happening here in our text. Now hear me. Let me see your eyeball. This reversal has a single focus. A single focus. One singular focus. It's the birth of a baby. The birth of a baby. Now do you see why we need to understand the context? For unto us a child is born. The for ties it to what's been said or what's been going on before. You have to look at the context in order to understand the magnitude of what God is saying. All these things are going to happen. Light is going to change to darkness. Bondage and freedom are going to be eliminated. Joy instead of sorrow. The reversal is this child born. Matthew 4 quotes this as being fulfilled in the birth of Mary's baby Jesus. As was spoken by the prophet, is what Matthew says. He is the child whose birth is the pivotal point. Darkness gives way to light. Anguish is replaced with joy. Those living in bondage are set free. What is it about this child that makes all the difference? What is it that makes him the turning point of all of these things? What is it? What makes this so significant? How do we attribute this child, this birth, to this amazing reversal? Well, there are four names in verse number 6. Four series of names, duo names, four collections of names that are designed to answer those questions. Those names describe his character. They give us insight into his mission. They tell us what Jesus came to do. They tell us who he is. They tell us, listen, they tell us why Christmas is really worth celebrating. Are you aware that Christmas is one of the leading times of the entire year when people suffer from deep, distraught anxieties, emotions, despair, depression? There's a whole lot of folks in the world that find Christmas the most difficult time of the year. I mean, the song says it's the most wonderful time of the year, but to many people it's not. And many of us who have some years on us think about Christmas and we remember when our children were small. Or remember when things were different. I get asked, well, what do you want for Christmas? And I say, I don't know. I really don't need anything. And Vicki will tell me, well, you got to pick something. Got to pick something. But would you agree that sometimes it's the most difficult time of the year? And I think that's because we try to find satisfaction in the things that surround the celebration, and we forget about the focus of the celebration. So what I want to convince you of over these next series of messages is that Christmas is worth celebrating. Because this one born takes on the darkness and brings light. He takes on the sorrow and he brings joy. He takes on the bondage that you and I might face before salvation or after salvation, the bondage that we might face for sin in our lives, and he brings freedom. Christmas is worth celebrating. Now, each of the names has two parts. Look at them in verse 6. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This morning we're going to look just at the Wonderful Counselor part. Wonderful Counselor. First of all, we're told that Jesus is wonderful. Now let me make a significant point. Are you ready? Wonderful is not an adjective. It's not an adjective. Now, when you look at that, you think, oh, that's an adjective. He's a counselor, and he's a wonderful one. Wonderful is not an adjective, it's a noun. In fact, it is a formal noun. It's the Hebrew word pele, and it's a formal noun. In other words, it's a masculine formal noun. That's why it has a capital W. In the Old Testament, this word pele describes something that is miraculous, it is supernatural, and it is one of those things that transpires that's really beyond our ability to comprehend what just happened. It was used in describing the parting of the Red Sea. That's what it was used. In Exodus 15, they came back and they said, who is like unto you, O Lord? And among the gods, who is like thee, O glorious one in holiness, fearful in praise, doing wonders? Pele. It describes that which is far above our natural capacity to comprehend. A wonder of supernatural, transcendent magnitude. Wonderful. Wonderful is what it's saying. One of the commentators that I read this week, E.J. Young, said wonderful designates the Messiah not merely as someone extraordinary, but as one who in his very person and being is a wonder. Did you hear that? As one who is in his very person and being a wonder. He is that, he said, which surpasses human thought and human power. Nothing else. No one else could bring about and reverse the fortunes of the people in such dire circumstances and cause them to pivot so dramatically. The birth of Jesus Christ is that single great wonder. The life of Jesus Christ is that single great wonder. His death, his burial, his resurrection is the single great wonder of the ages. It pivots, everything pivots on it. Why do you think we have BC AD? What was the pivot? Jesus. Why do you think we have people who are delivered? What's the pivot? Jesus. He's the great one whom all these things pivot around. He alone can take us in our darkness and bring us into light. Paul says that throughout Romans. Those who walked in darkness truly have seen a gospel light of salvation. Only Jesus can do that. He's the only one who can meet us in our sorrows. He's the only one that can truly wipe away every tear from our eyes. Jesus knows, and he knew what it was like to feel sorrow, to be weary, to be misunderstood, to be maligned. He understands and meets us in our sorrow. Only he can come to us in our bondage, both before salvation and after salvation, and set us free. Light and joy and freedom are his to give, and he gives them freely. That's his gift to us. He delights to give them to us. He is a great wonder. So Isaiah said he's the Wonderful Counselor. Let's talk about the second part of that name, Counselor. Now, when you hear Counselor, what do you think about? A psychiatrist, a psychologist, a minister, a lawyer. Think in those terms, do we not? You can almost see someone in your mind thinking, okay, here's somebody sitting in a chair, laying on a couch, and there's somebody sitting nearby them saying, well, tell me about your childhood. When we think of counselor, those are the terms in which we think, but that's really not what's being said here. The word counselor transcends that. This word is a description of one who possesses wisdom that is so far above and so far beyond our ability to understand and comprehend. Rather than listening to God, Judah was being led by a man who lacked true wisdom. Rather than listening to God, he chose to go his own way. Ahaz became his own counselor. So he fits the description of some trust in chariots and some in princes. But Isaiah is calling us to put our trust in the wonderful counselor, the child who would come. It speaks powerfully to him. Isaiah chapter 11 speaks in a more expanded way about this. Listen to what he says. He will be endowed, this child, with the spirit of wisdom and understanding. He will be endowed with the spirit of counsel and strength, the spirit of knowledge and reverence for the Lord. He will judge, listen, not by what his eyes see, and he will not decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he will judge, and with equity he will decide. If you've read the Gospels, you realize that Jesus had this amazing ability to understand what people are thinking. He loved to do that to the Pharisees. You know, he knew what was in their heart. He knew what was in their mind. Now that's a pretty interesting counselor. Can you imagine going to a counselor and he doesn't have to ask you, tell me about your childhood. You walk in, he says, oh, well, I already know all about you. You were born to da-da-da-da. That's the kind of counselor that Jesus is. It's beyond our comprehension. Now, he's not also, I want you to make sure you understand that Jesus is not some counselor that is above and beyond us. I mean, would you go to a counselor who grew up in a prestigious home and had everything handed to them? No need was unmet. No real undue demands or requirements placed upon them. And so they were sent off to this really elite school and they got a degree, and so now they're a counselor. Would you go to that person? Could they relate to you with what you've been through? No. But this one, Jesus, this wonderful counselor, who is a great wonder, is Emmanuel, God with us. Truly and fully God. He's the wonderful counselor also because he's fully man. He experienced our world. In his humanity, the scriptures remind us, he learned obedience by the things that he suffered. It tells us he increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. He has been touched with the feelings, the Bible says, of our infirmities. He's able to sympathize with us in our weaknesses. As the old song says, Jesus knows all about our troubles. He knows the depths of our sorrow. He suffered the guilt of sin, not his, but ours. He's the one who understands. He's the sufficient counselor. He meets us in those crisis situations of life. He guides so that we are not left to the best guesses or to the fickleness of our own wisdom. Jesus is the one who loves without reserve when everyone else holds back. He's the one who gives grace to pardon. He gives comfort to uphold you when every other resource runs dry. He is a wonder. He walks on water. He causes people to recover and be well, whether they're lame or blind or deaf or feeble. He calms seas, raises dead people. He took our sin upon himself, gives us grace and mercy in return. Then unbelievably, his righteousness is imputed to us. What a wonder he truly is. He is a wonderful counselor. Now, it's Communion Sunday. Communion, I believe, is an apt description or an apt illustration of Jesus as the wonderful counselors. Think about it. One of the things that continues to overwhelm me, and I ask myself, used to, why did God do that? If you read the gospel accounts, you read and you understand all that Jesus went through. Why did he do that? And he did that for me. And he did that for you. It was because of his great wonder and his great love for us. What an amazingly wonderful thing. Revelation describes a moment in heaven John saw when the saints gather around the throne of God. Every nation is represented. Every people is represented. And God gathers his eternal throng of people, and we're gathered around the throne. And John said there was silence. You want to know what that silence is about? It's wonder. It's wonder. Oh my goodness. There's no way I could have imagined this. That's all because of what he has done. And these elements speak to that. Now think about it. He's the wonderful counselor. It's amazing what he has done for us, is it not? But he's a counselor. To get people to remember that, think about it. If you turn this over to a group of even savvy evangelicals, we would come up with a very elaborate plan on how to continue to have people to remember what Jesus did. And no doubt we'd publish the findings in, a 273-page document. Here you go. All you got to do is read this, commit most of it to memory, and you'll be able to remember what Jesus did for you. But this counselor, at the end of a Passover meal, took a little piece of bread. Who gets excited about bread? It's common. It's every day. But he took a little piece of bread and he took a cup with the fruit of the vine. And in wisdom, he said, do this in remembrance of me. you see, he's the wonderful counselor. And this supper, this celebration, this communion is an illustration of that. It's his broken body. It's his shed blood. Now the Bible warns us in 1 Corinthians 11 that we can take this in an unworthy way if we do so without discerning the body and the blood of Christ. It's important. It's important to understand that this is nothing more than a little piece of unleavened bread. We haven't prayed over it. It doesn't become, necessarily holy. What it is it's the element that God uses to bring about this spiritual remembrance. But that takes understanding for what it stands for. This is my body, which is broken for you. Jesus hung on the cross in my place. Then he took the cup. This is my blood shed for you. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. So here in my hand is a living illustration, a living remembrance of the grace, the mercy, salvation that I have and that you can have